Howdy, folks. This is just a reminder that if you like this content, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. And be sure to hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video. Hope you enjoy this.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Happy Feast of All Saints to you. Jimmy Aiken, our guest. All the questions coming from the internet. And last time we had a question, I was just telling Jimmy this at the break, where the part of the person's identity was I4H8D, and I thought I was reading it like you try to, when you try to read a license plate.
A rebus.
Is that okay? Now explain. Of course, you've got a vocabulary word for it. What's a rebus? What does that mean?
A rebus is a message that is written partly in letters and partly in symbols. So, like if there's a symbol of a bee, the animal that flies around and makes honey. Right. You could treat it as in a rebus as part of the verb be.
Oh yeah.
So a rebus is typically a mix of letters and symbols. Sometimes they're really complex, but to quote Hemlock Stones, sometimes it's just a simple rebus. Any simple English schoolboy could catch it.
Well, that's what I was like, is that a rebus? Like, am I supposed to know what this is? But I don't know. I like there's a lot of stuff that goes on now, memes and all these. I'm like,
Leet speak.
Somebody
is
gets
a modern version.
What's it called?
Leet speak.
Leet speak? What does that mean?
Yeah, Leet speak is it's like an internet rebus where you mix typically letters and numbers. So, like, you would spell leet, L33T.
Oh, yes, that's what I thought it was. Right.
It's short for elite speak. If you're one of the elite, you know how to read this kind of stuff. And it arose among gamers and so forth. But in the string I4H8D, H8D could be leet speak for hated.
That's what
But I don't know what I4 hated means.
I know that. Okay. All right. Good. I hate when somebody has the license plate that you're supposed to be able to decipher and I can't decipher it. I feel like I'm just trying to go to the grocery store and now I'm baffled by your stupid thing. It's going to bother me all day that I can't decipher your license plate. All right, back to questions we go. We got a lot of questions from the internet for Jimmy this hour. And this one comes from Keith Lewis, 8949, which I'm pretty sure is just an actual name. Do you think God speaks to you?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by speaks. Now, there's a spectrum of different ways in which God could communicate with someone. And sort of at the top of that spectrum is God communicating to you, or at least close to the top of it, is God communicating to you in audible words where you hear a divine voice. That's what's known as a locution. And then kind of a step down from that is not where you hear an audible voice, but you hear like a mental voice. So it still comes in the form of words, but you know that I'm not hearing it with my ears. I'm hearing it with my mind. And then a step down from that would be having a strong intuition about something where it doesn't come in words, but the content, the informational content is still communicated and still clearly, something beyond the normal thought processes you would have. And then a step down from that would be being able to deduce messages from God. And then a step down from that would be being able to deduce messages, but not on a regular basis, but like looking at the broad strokes of your life history and being able to deduce from that what God would want you to know. And then a step below that, it gets progressively grayer as you go down. So God does not speak to me with an audible voice. God does not speak to me with a mental voice. He could do either one of those. He just hadn't so far as I know. When it comes to having strong intuitions, well, I do sometimes have strong intuitions, but I don't know that they're coming from God. They might be coming from me, or they might be coming from elsewhere. A step below that of deducing things some people talk about getting a lot of deductions from God about their life. I knew they do something that I refer to as theologizing their life. Like I used to know a woman who did a lot of theologizing of her life. She would say, God is teaching me this right now, and God is teaching me this right now, based on things that were happening to her in her daily life. And I was always suspicious of that. I mean, I didn't challenge her, because God works differently with different folks, and maybe she is correctly discerning lessons from God based on little individual incidents that are happening to her. But I would not feel so confident in my own ability to make those deductions. I tend to think that I can look at the broad strokes of my life history and figure out things from God based on that. So if that's what you mean by does God speak to me, I would say yes. In looking at the broad strokes of my life history, I can deduce certain lessons that I think God wants me to learn. Most of the time, though, if I'm looking at very recent incidents and, little narrow things, I think there's a lot of noise in the system that prevents me from being able to make lots of quick individual deductions. I have to kind of take the long view and make deductions. So what I tend to do is I don't really look for divine voices or divine messages in every little incident. Instead, what I do is I say to God, I'm going to do the best I can and trust you to guide me along the way, even if I'm not aware of you guiding me. And so that's how I tend to relate to God.
Keith, thank you. What a great question. Appreciate that. It's an internet open forum. Ask Me Anything. Jimmy Aiken, our guest. This one comes from Sighthound Lady, 15. I'm actively reading and studying my Bible, and one of my top concerns is if the Jewish people were given adequate chance to believe that Jesus was God and that his teachings were true. Obviously, the Jewish people have continued on, and is that not what God wanted? Any discussion on the topic would be appreciated. Thank you, Jimmy and his team. We're the team. That's us. We're included.
Yeah.
All right, Darren.
Yeah.
And me. Zach.
Okay, so I would say that the Jewish people were given an adequate chance to believe that Jesus is God, but that has to be understood with some nuance. In the first place, there was, and this comes as a surprise to many individuals today, both Jewish and Christian, there was an awareness in Second Temple Judaism, which is when Jesus lived, of a concept known as the two powers in heaven doctrine. This was a part of, it was considered a legitimate Jewish opinion. It was not shared by all Jews, but it was part of the Jewish religious culture at the time, the belief that in addition to Yahweh, the God up in heaven, there's also a second divine figure up there, someone who's also somehow God, who is called the lesser Yahweh in some texts. And Jesus identifies himself with that lesser Yahweh, who is also known as the Son of Man. So it was a little easier for people to believe. Now, later, the rabbis got rid of this concept. But in Jesus's own day, this concept was on the table. And so that made it a little easier for some Jews to recognize Jesus as divine. Some Jews obviously accepted his claim. They were the first generation of Christians. Some Jews did not accept his claim in a way where it looks like they're at fault, like Caiaphas, for example, the high priest who puts him to death. Looks like Caiaphas has a bad conscience in this matter, and other Jewish leaders could too. In terms of the Jewish people continuing, well, non-Christian Jews have definitely continued, but there's some evidence that actually most Jews became Christian in later centuries. The population in the Roman world of Jews to non-Jews was something like 10%. Something like 10% of the people in the Roman world were Jews. Well, today, Jews are not 10% of the population in Europe or the Americas. Judaism is, in fact, there's only like 16 million Jews in the world. The Jewish population, globally speaking, and of course this includes people in Africa and the Americas and Asia that they didn't know about back then, but it's only 0.2%. So of the global population is Jewish. What it looks like, though, and I've seen historians argue this, is that the Christian mission to the Jews was broadly successful. Most Jews did become Christian over the next few centuries. What about those, though, who were not at fault, like Caiaphas, but who also either didn't hear the Christian message or didn't become Christian through no fault of their own? Well, God knows that. If you're not a Christian, if you don't believe Jesus is God through no fault of your own, God knows it's not your fault, and He's not gonna hold you accountable for it. So, for things that aren't your fault, so it's still possible for people like that to be saved. God did want the Jewish people to continue as an ethnic identity. In fact, St. Paul discusses that in the book of Romans, and he indicates that prior to the second coming, there will be a large-scale corporate conversion of Jewish people to the Christian faith. And that presupposes that there were continuing non-Christian Jews during that time period. And Paul says, even though they're enemies of yours for the sake of the gospel, they're still beloved on account of their forefathers. So God had made promises to the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And even if a Jew was not a Christian, they still were God was still fulfilling His promises to them, and they were continuing to benefit from that relationship with God, even if it's not a complete or perfect or even an individually saving relationship. But what we can be confident of is God treats everybody, God loves everybody. He treats everybody fairly. And if you have not been given a presentation sufficient to convince you in good faith to believe in Jesus, then God can still work with you in spite of that and can still bring you to Himself in the afterlife in heaven.
Sighthound Lady, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful question. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's Ask Me Anything. Internet variety. We'll continue with that right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Catholic Answers Live.
Do you have a question but prefer to ask it privately? Catholic Questions can help. Go to CatholicQuestions.com to ask your question online, email us, drop us a letter, or give us a call. Longtime Catholic Answers Live apologist and author Jim Blackburn or another Catholic Questions apologist will be happy to assist you. Catholic Questions proudly supports Catholic Answers Live, so visit us at CatholicQuestions.com today. That's CatholicQuestions.com.
Another great podcast on EWTN Podcast Central is Way of the Fathers. It's a podcast about the fathers and doctors of the Church, the foundational figures of Christian history, hosted by Dr. Jim Papandrea. You can hear this and other faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates around the world at EWTN Podcast Central. Visit EWTN.com/radio and click on Podcast Central today.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Jimmy is senior apologist here at Catholic Answers. You're always hearing me giving away a couple of his books. The Bible is a Catholic book. We give away a lot, and very often you hear me give away a Daily Defense, 365 Days Plus One to Becoming a Better Apologist. I especially like to give that book to people who say, I'm a catechist, or I'm working in the RCIA or OCIA, or those kind of teachers. Just a wonderful resource with 366 questions that get asked about that, sometimes challenges that are made to the Catholic faith, and then one-page answers. But also you'll hear, but sometimes I give away the book, The Words of Eternal Life, True Happiness and Where to Find It, especially for people who are kind of seeking. But Jimmy's got lots of great books in addition to the podcasts that we've already talked about. You can find them over at shop.catholic.com or wherever you get your good Catholic books.
Welcome to Books I Have Given Away by Cy Kelly.
I know. I do give away a lot of your books, however. And I am enjoying the names today. I don't know. I'm enjoying the questions very much. I do feel, as I said to you at the break, I feel like these are great questions today. But the names have been good as well. And this one comes from Obliviax1112. And Obliviax asks, "Good evening, Jimmy, from the UK. I have a question about the sacrament of confession. In the Old Testament, people brought animal sacrifices to the priest to atone for their sins, with the size of the sacrifice corresponding to the severity of the sin, if I remember rightly. This is mirrored in the early church, as confession was a public act, where individuals admitted their sins before the entire congregation. However, this practice evolved into the private one-on-one confessions we know today, largely due to the influence of Irish monks, who introduced this method in the early medieval period. Some have argued that because the form of confession has changed over time, the seal of confession could also be altered. How can I explain this development to non-Catholics and some Catholics too? Thank you, Jimmy. May God continue to bless and guide you all."
Well, thank you, Obliviax. And since you said good evening to us from the UK, good afternoon from Arkansas, and from Cy Kellett's perspective, good morning from California. So you're right that in the Old Testament there were sacrifices to deal with sin, principally animal sacrifices. We don't actually have evidence, at least good convincing evidence, that the size of the animal sacrifice corresponded to the severity of the sin. What we find with some of the sacrifices, there's several different types of sacrifices they had, and even though several of them could deal with sin, we're not 100% sure which sacrifices went with sin and in what way. There's information we don't have about how the ancient sacrificial system worked. What we do have in the case of some sacrifices is a graded scale, not based on the severity of the sin, but on the wealth of the offerer. So like if you're a king, you're a rich dude. Guess what? You're given a bull. But if you're an ordinary farmer, you're not rich, you might give a lamb. Or if you're poor, you might give a bird, or potentially even a grain offering in substitution for an animal. So the gradation that you're referring to, at least in terms of what we can demonstrate, is not so much tied to the severity of the sin, but to the wealth of the offerer of the sacrifice. In terms of the shifting of how confession is administered, well, it is true that there has been a development, and there was originally more one-on-one, more public confession in the early church, and one-on-one confession was promoted by Irish monks in the early centuries, but even before private confession became the norm, which it is today, there was private confession happening in the early church. We have records of it, even before it was the norm. And I quote some in The Fathers Know Best, I quote some people talking about that. But you're right that the administration of the sacrament has developed, and one of the things that's developed is the seal of confession. If the church found by experience that people are much more willing to confess if they are given absolute assurance that the information is not going to go further. And so out of that, the seal of confession developed, which is essentially, legislation to ensure confidentiality. Now, could that change in the future? So why did that change is the first question. The answer was because the church discovered if you give people assurance of confidentiality, they will confess more. And that's what we want. We want people getting right with God. We want them to use this sacrament, and instituting the seal of confession helped them use this sacrament. So there was a rational basis for introducing this. Could it change in the future? Well, since the seal of confession is a product of merely ecclesiastical law, it's not part of divine law, the answer is yes, it could change in the future. Do I think it's likely to change in the future? No, not anytime in the foreseeable future. The church is very well convinced of the benefits of this, and I don't see any practical basis for that being revisited anytime in the future that I can foresee.
Obliviacs, thank you for the question, and thanks for listening over there in the UK. We're glad you do. I hope we'll get to interact again sometime. This question comes from Duff Beer. Yep, that's the name the person gave.
And you know where Duff Beer is from?
The Simpsons.
The Simpsons, right.
Yeah. And I think they actually make Duff Beer. I think somebody made it in the real world. All right, Duff Beer. Duff Beer asks this. I've watched your Mysterious Worlds episode on young Earth, old Earth, and the flood, but would it be permissible for a Catholic to interpret Genesis as a poetic narrative describing God's creation of man and culling of the most evil men in our distant past by, 1, reading Adam and Eve being earlier hominids when our ancestors became able to reason instead of being driven by instinct, and in turn, after sinning against God by eating from a possibly metaphorical tree of knowledge, wow, this is a lot, our brain capacity started to expand, causing more difficult births. 2, reading the flood as being a story about God destroying more sinful versions of our ancestors, causing a population bottleneck as far back as 900,000 years ago. Okay, I'll continue. Converting to Catholicism from a secular background, reading the Old Testament as divinely inspired truths seen and expressed through a lens of contemporary culture, when each part of the Old Testament was written, removes all the stumbling blocks to finding my faith. But I don't know if my interpretation stretches what is written too far.
Okay, so we sort of have two issues there. The first one is the question, are these ideas permissible? And the second is, do these ideas stress the interpretation of the text too far? So let's deal with those independently. The first one, would it be permissible to read Genesis as a not fully literal narrative that understands Adam and Eve as early hominids, and it describing the process by which hominids the human line became more intelligent, resulting in more difficult births? Well, it's true that the rise of human intelligence is tied to difficulty in having birth, because we've got, compared to other creatures, we have freaky big craniums to house our ginormous oversized brains that help us think smart. And that means these huge craniums have to fit through the birth canal of a human woman, which is complicated by the fact that we walk on two legs, that we're bipedal. And so the rise of bipedalism and the rise of human intelligence, which are also linked because that freed up our hands to allow us to manipulate objects in our environment, and that also helped boost human intelligence. The rise of bipedalism and the rise of human intelligence both made for more difficult births, which is why, compared to other creatures, humans are born basically completely dependent on their parents for everything. You know, you look at other creatures, like let's say a baby deer. If you watch a mama deer giving birth, plop, out comes the baby deer, and within a few minutes it's running around. Mm-hmm. You know, because mama deer can't pick up the baby deer and carry it, and their lifestyle as deer is based on running away from things. That's their success strategy. Our success strategy is being smart. Their success strategy is running away from stuff. So little baby deer's got to be able to get up and run around really quick. But human babies come out, plop, and it can't do anything. For years, it can't do anything. It's got to be carried by the parents. It can't eat on its own. It's got to be fed by the parents. Well, it's because we are going to end up so terrifically smart compared to other terrestrial creatures that that brain case has to fit through the birth canal of a bipedal woman, and that means that we've got to be born really early and undeveloped and helpless, and then we have to be cared for years. And not only can our kids not do anything for themselves, the one thing they can do is scream, and so they do. And they scream a phenomenal amount. I mean, evolutionary biologists talk about this. Our kids yell their heads off when they are small, way more than is even needed to get their basic needs met. Why does that happen? Because you look at other species like deer, do their kids yell their heads off? No. Other species, the kids, unless they're predators, the kids tend to be quiet because they don't want to attract attention from predators. Well, you could think the same thing could apply to humans because they're born helpless. They are prey waiting to be taken, except for the fact they've got their parents around to protect them. And their parents are super smart. And their parents will kick the butt of anything that tries to harm their babies. And so the fact our babies yell their heads off and annoy their parents so much is testimony to the fact that we own this rock. But there's more to say, and I'll say it on the other side of the break.
Duff Beer, thanks for the question. We will get to the rest of the answer right after this, and lots more questions to come. Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin continues on Catholic Answers Live. When the resurrected Jesus appeared to disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him until the breaking of the bread. The same is true today. In the Holy Eucharist, we really meet Jesus. In The Eucharist is Really Jesus, author Joe Heschmeyer explains how knowing Jesus in the Eucharist is the key to understanding all of Christian faith. Order your copy of The Eucharist is Really Jesus today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers monthly giving club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
We hope that one of the things that we communicate here at Catholic Answers Live is that our Catholic faith allows us to be fully serious about all the problems we encounter in the church and in the world, but it also lets us have light hearts and maybe even mix in a bit of fun, and that is exactly what our good friend Joe Heschmeyer does in his popular podcast, Shameless Popery. You should check it out at shamelessjoe.com. Joe's got a deep grasp of the faith, morals, the teachings of the church, all that, but he's also got a witty conversational style. He entertains and he informs, but you will leave equipped to better answer the most common challenges, misconceptions, and questions about the Catholic faith. He's got insightful guests, he does on-air debates, and he takes a close look into all the things that you want to know about as a Catholic living today. You'll walk away knowledgeable and filled with joy. Look for Joe on his YouTube channel. Check him out at shamelessjoe.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, become a patron. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin this hour, and all the questions, however, have come from the internet. This one and people have very funny names that they use on the internet. This one comes from someone named Duff Beer, and it's a long question, Jimmy. So I maybe
I'll summarize.
Yeah,
it.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So the chunk of the question I'm looking at is it permissible to understand Genesis as a narrative that treats Adam and Eve as being earlier hominids because they would be members of the species Homo, or the group of species Homo, when Adam and Eve's rise to intelligence, because they gain wisdom by eating from the tree of knowledge, and then Eve gets cursed with having painful childbirth. Could we read this as a narrative about how humans developed intelligence? Would that be permitted? Yes, it would. The idea that Adam and Eve were just two individuals is something the church has historically supported. It's been the default assumption down through history, but in the 20th century, there was a lot, and actually it predates the 20th century, but in the 20th century, there was a lot of discussion of this. And these days, I won't go through it blow by blow. I've done that before, and I can do that again in the future. But the magisterium is showing flexibility on whether Adam and Eve were two individuals, or whether they were a symbol, or whether they represent larger populations. But these days, all of those are permitted. So yes, you could propose this. The second part of the question was, would it be permissible to read the flood narrative as a story about God destroying more sinful versions of our ancestors, causing a population bottleneck as far back as 900,000 years ago? And the answer, again, would be yes. The church doesn't have any teachings that would prevent you from reading it that way. So you could understand both of these narratives in the ways you propose. But then there's the second half of the question, which is, do these interpretations stretch the text too far? And this is just a personal opinion. So the answer to the first two questions was, yeah, you can take them this way. But in regard to the second aspect of the question, does it stretch the interpretation of the text too far? I would say it does. I don't think it's likely that the author of Genesis would have traditions to compose the text that dated as far back as 900,000 years or even further in the case of the origins of humanity. I do believe there are traditions that can last for thousands of years, especially if the traditions are connected with basically permanent fixtures in our environments. Like, we have evidence that the constellation, the Great Bear, Ursa Major, is at least 15,000 years old. And we know that because the asterism or representation of the Great Bear is subtly different in East Asia and North America on the one hand versus how it's understood in Europe. In Europe, the asterism, that's the design of which stars connect to which stars, for the Great Bear, has the bear with a big long tail. Cy Kellett, let's test your biology knowledge. Do bears have big long tails?
My biology knowledge comes entirely from a stuffed bear I had as a child, but they do not have big long tails.
Correct. They got little stubby tails. So it's weird that in Europe, the Great Bear has a big long tail, but in East Asia, it doesn't. In East Asia, the three stars of its tail are three hunters that are hunting the bear. And there's another little star up top that is a little bird that's telling the hunters where to go to find the bear. And that's exactly how the Great Bear is interpreted in North America among North American Indians. And what that tells us is that this understanding of the Great Bear must predate the colonization of North America by East Asians coming over the Siberian land bridge, which was a minimum of 15,000 years ago. So the Great Bear, which you can look, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, you can look up in the sky and see it every night and tell your kids about it. It looks like that tradition is a minimum of 15,000 years old. So I think there are deep time traditions, but the idea of one going back to 900,000 years ago, which on anybody's estimation predates the development of modern human speech to pass down the tradition, I think that proposal, even though it's permitted, I think it would stretch the text too far. And so I would tend to, as I mentioned in the Mysterious World episodes that Duff Beer says he listened to, I would tend to prefer other interpretations that also don't insist that the text is literal, but that are based on traditions that the author of Genesis would have had access to. And that doesn't mean they don't contain additional insights that go back further, like the fact that human intelligence is connected with painful childbirth. That's a genuine insight. That's true. Mm-hmm. I don't think that the author of Genesis got this information by it being passed down from the time that Homo, developed 2 million years ago. But I think he had a valid insight, however he got it, and it is part of the narrative. So that's what I have to say about all that.
Well, I just want to say it one more time. Duff beer. Thank you very much. What a fascinating question. This next one comes from Ann Burke, 6705. How is a narcissist saved if he's in complete denial about being a narcissist?
Well, being a narcissist is a psychological condition that is not itself sinful. Narcissism is a preoccupation with oneself that doesn't give normal levels of compassion to other people. It's kind of related to psychopathy. In fact, narcissism is one of the characteristics of psychopathy, which is a lack of empathy. But these are psychological traits, and they're therefore not sinful in and of themselves. They could lead people to do sinful things. If you're insufficiently compassionate or empathetic to other people, you may not treat them the way you should. But the thing about narcissism and psychopathy is if this is really a personality trait, then it's like a handicap, and you're not going to be fully responsible for how you treat other people. You may be treating other people badly, but your own moral culpability is going to go down. And so it's going to vary from individual to individual depending on the degree of narcissism they have. Some people may have a degree of narcissism, but not so much that it alleviates them of their responsibility for treating other people well. Others may be so narcissistic that they're really not at fault for how they treat other people. And those individuals will be judged differently by God, depending on the state of their heart. If they are fundamentally responsible for their behavior, they will be judged for their behavior. If they are not fundamentally responsible for their behavior, then they won't be judged, accountable for their behavior. The behavior is still bad, but they won't be held accountable for it. And if they otherwise cooperate with God's grace, then they can still be saved.
Anne, thank you very much for that, for the question. This one comes from Shalom Kaysen. Is there a philosophical possibility that God exists without omnipotence? I heard an argument from a liberal Christian, Dr. Goff, which posits that a semi-powerful God would solve many theological quandaries, such as the problem of evil.
So, you do sometimes have finite godism proposed as a solution to the problem of evil, the idea being that God is still all good and would stop evil from happening if he could. He's just not powerful enough to do so. And finite godism would solve that problem, but we've got really good evidence for an infinite God. And so I would say, in terms of philosophical possibility, if you mean, can a philosopher imagine this? The answer is yes. But do I think it ultimately would work philosophically? I'd say no. We have really good evidence for the existence of an infinite God who is omnipotent and hypothetically could stop evil. The reason he doesn't, as we discuss frequently on the show, whenever anyone calls in and asks some variant of why does this bad thing happen, the answer is God tolerates it, because this is always the general answer. It's always the same. Evil would not happen if God did not have an equal or greater good that he was going to bring out of that very evil. So God tolerates evil in order to bring about greater good. And that's why it's rational for God to tolerate evil, because he will bring about a greater good. And that makes it tolerable for us to experience evil, because we know a greater good is coming and we won't suffer unjustly. So I agree that if you imagined a God who's not able to stop evil, that would solve your problem of evil, but it would create new problems. Namely, we've got really good evidence for an omnipotent God, and therefore, how do you deal with all that data if you propose just a finite God? So I don't ultimately think that it would be philosophically possible.
Shalom, thank you very much for the question. That brings us to the break. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's Ask Me Anything, internet version with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Hang on. Catholic Answers Live will return in a moment. Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
One of the biggest mistakes a Christian can make is to try to do good without God's help. Saint Therese said, "When we trust only ourselves and not God, our soul becomes incapable of virtue." Her remedy? Works of charity. And the greatest work of charity is to share the gospel. At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we encourage you to share the gospel with someone who doesn't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
Mother Angelica had a simple goal when she began EWTN: to reach the world with the gospel message. Today, EWTN is the largest Catholic media organization in the world, broadcasting in multiple languages 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We've never wavered from our mandate to proclaim the truth and majesty of the Catholic faith. Thank you for joining EWTN in this mission.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I just got a detail right before we came back that I just need to clarify this. You can read 10,000 words an hour?
Yeah, approximately.
Oh. Is that like I read if I listen to it at I think 1.25, I think that's the speed I go at, or maybe it's 1.2. Would that be 10,000 words an hour? Or,
no, I tend to listen to things at 1.5.
Oh, I might try that.
And that would be 10,000 words in about 40 minutes.
Oh, wow. Okay. By the way, the reason that this came up, I was asking Jimmy about the encyclical from Pope Francis, and it's 31,000 words, and you just said that's about a 3-hour read, and I was like, that's 10,000 words an hour. I've never measured how much I could read in an hour, but all right. Well, it's open forum. It's Ask Me Anything. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and this one comes from Hate, spelled Hagit. Hello, Mr. Akin. What do you think of religious orders?
Well, religious orders are organizations where people join themselves together in some form of common life. It doesn't mean they always live together, but they have a common form of life and spiritual discipline by which they consecrate themselves to the service of God and the service of other humans, either in a direct practical way or via their prayers. And I think it's a good thing to serve God, and I think it's a good thing to serve other human beings. And so I think religious orders are fundamentally good things. They're not meant for everybody, but they are one of the 3 vocations that are recognized in Catholic teaching, the other 2 being matrimony and holy orders. And I think they're good. Now, that doesn't mean every individual religious order or religious house is good. There can be ones that have problems in various degrees, and occasionally there have been ones that have been suppressed because they were really problematic. But on balance, I think that religious orders are good things, and that they correspond to a fundamental desire on the part of some humans to not just consecrate themselves to God in a general way by being people of faith, but to consecrate themselves to God in a more particular way. And we even see in the New Testament the equivalent of an order of religious women, because St. Paul talks about widows who have taken a vow of consecration to Jesus such that they won't remarry. He mentions this in the pastoral epistles. And in the Old Testament, we see a religious order too. We see the Nazarites, where a Nazir or a Nazirah, for the feminine form, take a special rite of consecration to God. They shave their heads. They are not allowed to consume grape products of any form for the term of their consecration, so they can't get drunk, for example. And some Nazarites are Nazarites for life. They take lifelong vows. Others take them for a temporary period of time. We have evidence that St. Paul took a Nazirite vow at one time for a limited period. So we see religious orders in the Bible themselves. Incidentally, in modern Hebrew, the word for monk, because, they got Christian monasteries over in Israel, the word for monk is Nazir. Oh. Because it's so obvious. The Old Testament Nazirites are the same thing as Christian monks. They use the same word for them. They're Nazirs or Nazirim.
Oh, hey, thanks very much for the question. On we go. Christian Cuber 096 is next. Cuber probably does the Rubik's Cube and those things. Is it a correct understanding of the Catholic faith to say that when Jesus suffered and died, that only his human nature suffered and died, and not the divine person?
It would not, I'm not saying that language can't be used, but it is not the way the church articulates this matter. And if you say it that way, it will be understood as having erroneous implications, because it's not just a nature that suffers, it's a person. If I take a nail and I drive it through one of my feet with a hammer, I don't have my nature suffering. I, the person, Jimmy Aiken, am suffering. And since Jesus is one person, that person suffers. It is now, and since he has a divine nature by essence, that means he's a divine person by essence. And so a person that is divine is suffering. If you were to deny that, then now there is a truth in what you're trying to express. His divine nature does not suffer, because his divine nature is impassible. But if you say his divine nature does not suffer, you're right. But if you say a divine person did not suffer, you're wrong. So the locus or place of suffering is not in a nature. It's nature is what it is. It's a complete reality. Natures do not suffer. If we may sometimes speak metaphorically as if they did, but properly speaking, even if you kill 6 million human beings in the Holocaust, human nature does not suffer, because the people you didn't kill still have complete human natures. So natures do not suffer. Persons suffer. Jesus is a divine person, and therefore, to reflect the full truth, we need to say that a divine person suffered. But if you want to say, well, he suffered in his human nature, I know what you're talking about, but you're not saying it right, because properly speaking, natures don't suffer.
Christian Cuber, great question. Thank you very much for that one. I don't know if this is eSpycraft or SBcraft, but I'll go.
Or Espycraft.
Espycraft is also, all right, I'll do that. Espycraft 2005 YT. How to find the truth in the world of excess information?
Well, so I'm sensitive to this. I do lots of research, and I would say a couple of things. The first one is, in a world of excess information, cut out the bad information. Don't waste your time looking at sources that you know are inferior. Look at the best sources that are available. And that way, if you're not looking at the excess information, you're only looking at the high quality information, then that'll make it easier to find truth. Second thing is, as part of looking at the high quality information, you want to look at information from both sides of it, whatever question you're examining, because you want every idea, if you're really trying to find truth, you want it to be able to survive tests. And so you cross-examination by other viewpoints. And so what I do when I'm researching a subject, I try to find the best sources I can on both sides and read them both and think about them both and digest them both and pit them against each other and see which side has the best argument. So I would say it's a two-step process. First step is cut out all the low-quality stuff. And second is take the best of different positions and then play intellectual monster truck rally with them and bash them into each other and see what survives.
Get bashing, Spycraft. Thank you very much for the question. I'm going to keep going because we've got time to get more in, so on we go. EM Show asks this. I would love to know a breakdown of the evidence for and against global warming, and in particular, the degree to which human activity plays a role in this. I ask this of Jimmy because he may be one of the only people I would trust to give an unbiased assessment.
Well, thank you. Thank you, EM. I take that as a compliment. I try to be very, very balanced on matters like this, and it actually relates to the previous question we just had about how to process information and get at the truth. I plan to do one or more Mysterious World episodes dealing with this subject in the future, and as part of my preparation for those episodes, I will do a bunch of research. And so for a number of years, I've been gathering sources on this subject, and like I said, I've tried to gather sources that are anthropomorphic global warming, human-caused global warming, and other sources that are opposed to that idea. And I plan to have a private intellectual monster truck rally with those positions and bash the arguments of the two camps against each other and see what emerges. I haven't done that yet. So at the moment, I hold my opinions in this area loosely because I may need to change them in the future. But I would say a couple of things that I think I'm pretty confident of at this point. One of them is that both sides need to be taken seriously. We shouldn't just dismiss either one. And secondly, a lot of the claims that you hear about global warming and humanity's role in it are hyperbolic, to put it charitably, or sensationalist, to put it a little less charitably. And frankly, the science shows signs of being cooked in this area. In fact, there are scientists who've done research into the subject who have said, yeah, I had to frame my paper in terms of global warming to make it support the climate, to make it support the scientific journal's preferred climate narrative. They wouldn't have published me if I didn't. So research that supports the idea of human-caused global warming is being promoted right now, whereas the reverse kind of research is not being promoted right now. And that leads to a research imbalance that can favor one narrative out of proportion to the scientific evidence. There also has been evidence of scientific fraud being committed by some practitioners of both sides. But you have scientific fraud is a real thing. It happens in all areas of science at an astonishingly high rate. And it definitely is happening in some global warming science. So those are some things I'm confident of. Do I think it's happening? Do I think humans are playing a notable role in it? Well, I'm open on those questions. I'm not going to rush to humanity as the primary cause because there are other causes. In fact, I saw a paper just the other day come across the Science News documenting that actually in a recent range of years, it was microbes, not humanity, that put more greenhouse gases into the environment. So there are other possibilities that need to be considered. I'll recommend, now it's easy to find stuff supporting man-made global warming. So I won't really focus on that at the moment, but I will give you two resource recommendations that I think would be worth you looking at. One of them is a YouTube channel called the Climate Discussion Nexus. This is a Canadian group that tends to be skeptical of a lot of global warming claims, and they frequently debunk them. So this is a good place to go if you want to see a counter narrative being developed. It's youtube.com/@climatedn. And I also would recommend a book called Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom by Dr. Patrick Moore, who was one of the founders of Greenpeace. And he, even as a founder of Greenpeace, is taken on a bunch of hyperbolic imaginary climate disasters. So fake invisible catastrophes and threats of doom by Dr. Patrick Bohr.
EM, thank you for that closing question. You can hear the music. That brings us to the end. We'll have to just say we'll see you next time, God willing, right here on Catholic Answers Live. And thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you, Cy. And before we go, just one more reminder that if you like what you've watched, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and especially by subscribing. I'm trying to grow my channel, and I'd really appreciate your help. Thank you, and God bless you.